Professor Lin just pointed out to me that the title of my speech is The Origin of Private Property in the Family Coffee Board. So if you have not noticed this from the program, but this is actually correct. So in the last minute, I slightly changed the subject. I will give a speech that has nothing to do with any practical problems or giving any type of advice what to do or not to do. My goal is simply to explain and make people grasp one of the most fundamental revolutions that took place in human history, the transition from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies and the development of the institutions of private property in land and associated with it, the institution of a family. What I will present is a very brief abstract of a long chapter within the framework of a major book project. It is reasonable to begin human history maybe 5 million years ago, when the human line of evolutionary descent separated from that of our closest non-human relative, namely the chimpanzee. It is also reasonable to begin at 2.5 million years ago with the first appearance of what's called Homo habilis, or 200,000 years ago, when the first representative of anatomically modern man made its appearance, or also 100,000 years ago when the anatomically modern men had become the standard human form. Instead, I want to begin only 50,000 years ago, and this is an eminently reasonable date also, because by that time humans had developed a full-fledged language which involved a radical improvement in their ability to learn and to innovate, and the anatomically modern men had evolved into what is called the behaviorally modern men, that is, the men who had adopted the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, of which even today few pockets remain in existence. Now, about 50,000 years ago, the number of modern humans may not have exceeded 5,000 people, confined to the northeast of Africa, today's Ethiopia. These people lived in societies that were composed of small bands of people, maybe 10 to 30 people, who occasionally met and formed some common genetic pool of about 150 people, or maybe up to 500 people, which is the size that geneticists have found to be necessary in order to avoid dysgenic effects. The division of labor among these people was very limited, with the main partition being that between women acting mostly as gatherers and men acting mostly as hunters. Nonetheless, life initially appears to have been extremely good for our forebears. Only a few hours of regular work allowed for a comfortable life with good high-protein nourishment and plenty of leisure time. Now, the life of hunters and gatherers faced a fundamental challenge, however. Hunter-gatherer societies led essentially parasitic lives. That is, they did not add anything to the nature-given supply of goods. They only depleted the supply of goods. They did not produce, apart from a few tools, but only consumed. They did not grow and breed, but had to wait for nature to regenerate and replenish. What this form of parasitism then involved was the inescapable problem of population growth. In order to maintain a comfortable life, the population density had to remain extremely low. It has been estimated that 1 square mile of territory was needed to comfortably sustain 1 or 2 persons, and in less fertile regions, even larger territories were necessary. Now, people could, of course, try to prevent such population pressure from emerging, and in fact, hunter-gatherer societies tried their very best in this regard. They induced abortions, they engaged in infanticide, especially in female infanticide, and they reduced the number of pregnancies by engaging in long periods of breastfeeding, which, in combination with the low body fat that is characteristic for constantly mobile and moving women, reduces fertility. Yet, while this alleviated the problem, it could not solve it. The population nonetheless kept increasing. Now, given that the population size could not be maintained at a stationary level, only three alternatives existed for the emerging excess population. One could give up the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and find a new mode of social organization. One could fight over the limited food supplies, or one could migrate. And while migration was by no means costless, after all, one had to leave known for unknown territories, it appeared for quite some time as the least costly option. Hence, setting out from their homeland in East Africa, successively the entire globe was conquered by bands of people breaking away from their relatives to form new societies in areas that were previously unoccupied by humans. Essentially, the process was always the same. A group invaded some territory, population pressure mounted, some people stayed put, a subgroup moved further on, generation after generation. And once broken up, practically no contact existed between the various hunter-gatherer societies. Consequently, although they were initially, of course, closely related to one another through direct kinship relations, these societies then formed separate genetic pools and, confronted with different natural environments and as a result of mutations and of genetic drift, interacting with natural selection, in the course of time they took on entirely and distinctly different appearances. Now, it appears that this process of migrating also began around 50,000 years ago, shortly after the emergence of behaviorally modern men and his acquisition of the skill to build boats. From this time until about 12,000 or 11,000 years ago, global temperatures gradually fell. They actually started falling already 120,000 years ago, at a time when hippos were still swimming in the Rhine and the Thames. So from 12,000 years on, temperatures gradually fell, and accordingly also the sea levels fell. People crossed over the Red Sea at the Gate of Grief, which was then merely a narrow gap of water dotted with some islands, to land at the northern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, which at that time enjoyed a comparatively wet period. From there onward, preferring initially to stay in tropical climates, to which one had been adjusted, the migration continued eastward. Travel occurred mostly by boat, because until about 6,000 years ago, when men learned how to tame horses, this form of transportation by boat was much faster and much more convenient than travel by foot. Migration then took place along the coastline and proceeded from there into the interior through the river valleys, first of all the way to India, and from there the population movement seems to have split into two directions. On the one hand, it proceeded around the Indian Peninsula to Southeast Asia and to Indonesia, which at that time was connected to the Asian mainland, and finally to the now founder continent of what is called Sahul, that is Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, which were joined together until about 8,000 years ago. And this now founder continent at that time was only separated from the Asian mainland by about a 60-mile wide channel of water, again sprinkled with islands, which permitted short distance island hopping. And they moved also northward then up the coast to China and eventually Japan. And on the other hand, the migration process went from India in a northwesterly direction through Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and ultimately to Europe. Later, and from this group moving northwesterly direction, another group split off and moved into a northeasterly direction into southern Siberia. There were also a few later migrations, most likely in 3 waves, with the first about 14,000 to 12,000 years ago, which went from Siberia across the Bering Strait, which was until 11,000 years ago a bridge, and onto the American continent, and apparently reached Patagonia only about 1,000 years later. And the last migration route set off from Taiwan, which was occupied about 5,000 years ago, sailing across the Pacific to reach the Polynesian islands, and finally, only about 800 years ago, New Zealand. Now, regardless of all the complicating details, at some point, it is easy to see, at some point, the land mass available to help satisfy human needs could no longer be enlarged. In economic jargon, the supply of the production factor land became fixed, and every increase in the size of human population had to be sustained by the same unchanged quantity of land. Now, from the economic law of returns, we know that this situation must result in a Malthusian problem. The law of returns states that for any combination of production factors, in the case that we have in front of us, land and labor, there exists an optimum combination. If one deviates from this optimum by increasing the input of only one factor, in our case labor, while the input of the other factor, land, is held constant, then the physical output produced either does not increase at all, or at least not in the ratio of the increased input. That is, other things remaining the same, an increase in the size of the population beyond a certain point is not accompanied by a proportional increase of wealth. If this point is passed, the physical output of goods produced per head diminishes. Living standards on the average will fall. A point of absolute overpopulation has been reached. Now, what to do when faced with this challenge? Of the formerly mentioned 3 available options in response to an increasing population pressure, namely to move, to fight, or to find a new mode of social organization, only the last 2 remained open. No more migrations possible. Now, here I want to just concentrate on the final one, that is the peaceful response. A new organization mode has to be found. The challenge that mankind faced was answered with a twofold response. On the one hand, through the economization of land, and on the other hand, through what we might call the privatization of the production of offspring. And these 2 things combine to the institution of the family and of private property, as I will explain now. To understand this response, one must first take a look at the treatment of the production factor land by hunter-gatherer societies. Now, it can be safely assumed that private property existed within the framework of a tribal household. Private property, for instance, existed with regard to things such as personal clothing, tools, implements, and ornaments. To the extent that such items were produced by particular identifiable individuals, especially if they were produced during their own leisure time, or if these things were acquired by others from their original makers either through gifts or exchange, those things were considered individual property. On the other hand, to the extent that goods were the result of some concerted or joint effort, they were considered to be collective goods. This applied most definitely to the means of sustenance, that is, to the berries gathered and the game hunted as a result of some intertribal division of labor. Now, without doubt then, collective property played a highly prominent role in hunter-gatherer societies, and it is because of this fact that the term primitive communism has been frequently employed in order to describe primitive tribal economies. In a way, for those economies it held that each individual contributed to the household income according to his abilities, and each received from the collective income according to his needs. Now, what about the ground land on which all these tribal activities took place? One can safely rule out that ground land was considered to be private property. But was it collective property? This has been typically assumed to be the case. In fact, however, ground land was neither private nor collective property, but instead constituted part of the environment, or more specifically, the general conditions of actions. Let me explain this. The external world in which man's actions take place can be divided into two distinct parts. On the one hand, there are those things that are considered means or economic goods, and on the other hand, there are those things that are considered to be the environment. The requirements for an element of the external world to be classified as a means or an economic good are threefold. First, in order for something to become an economic good, there must be a human need. Second, there must be the human perception of the thing believed to be endowed with a property causally connected with the satisfaction of this need. And third, and most important in the present context, an element of the external world which is so perceived must be under human control, such that it can be employed in order to satisfy this given need. That is, only if a thing is brought into a causal connection with a human need and this thing is under human control can one say that this entity is appropriated or has become a good and hence can be someone's property. On the other hand, if an element of the external world stands in a causal connection to a human need, but no one controls and interferes with it, then this element must be considered part of the unappropriated environment and hence is no one's property. Now, before the backdrop of these considerations, one can now answer the question regarding the status of ground land in a hunter-gatherer society. Certainly, the berries picked off the bush are property. But what about the bush, which is causally associated with the picked berries? The bush is only lifted from its original status as an environmental condition of action and a mere contributing factor to the satisfaction of human needs, to the status of property and a genuine production factor, once it has been appropriated. That is, once man has purposefully interfered with the natural causal process connecting bush and berry by, for instance, watering the bush or trimming its branches in order to produce a certain outcome, namely an increase of the berry harvest above the level otherwise achieved, only then has the bush become someone's property. Now, similarly, there is no question that a hunted animal is property. But what about the herd of which the animal was a part?
The herd must be regarded as unowned nature as long as man has done nothing that can be interpreted and that is in his own mind causally connected with the satisfaction of a perceived need. The herd becomes property only once the requirement of interfering with the natural chain of events in order to produce some desired result has been fulfilled. Now, this would be the case, for instance, as soon as man engages in the herding of animals. That is, as soon as he actively tries to control the movement of the herd. What about the groundland on which the controlled movement of the herd takes place, however? Now, according to our definitions, the herdsman cannot be considered the owner of the groundland because herders merely follow the natural movements of the herd, and their interference with nature is restricted to keeping the flock together so as to gain easier access to any one of its members should the need for the supply of animal meat arise. Herdsmen do not interfere with the land in order to control the movements of the herd. They only interfere with the movements of the members of the herd. Land only becomes property once herders give up herding and turn to animal husbandry instead. That is, once they treat land as a scarce means in order to control the movement of animals by controlling land. This would require that land is somehow embordered by fencing it in or by constructing some other obstacle which restricts the free natural flow of animals. Rather than being merely a contributing factor in the production of animal herds, land thus becomes a genuine production factor, only if it is fenced in. What these considerations demonstrate is that it is mistaken to think of land as a collectively owned property of hunter-gatherer societies. Hunters are not herdsmen, and still less are they engaged in animal husbandry. And gatherers are not gardeners or agriculturalists. They do not exercise control over the nature-given fauna and flora by tending to it or grooming it. They merely pick pieces from nature for the taking. Land to them is no more than a condition of their activities, but not their property. Now, what can be said to be the first step then toward a solution of the Malthusian trap faced by growing hunter-gatherer societies is precisely the establishment of property in land. Pressured by falling standards of living as a result of absolute overpopulation, members of the tribe successively appropriated more and more of the previously unowned nature. This appropriation of land had an immediate twofold effect. First, more goods were produced and accordingly more needs could be satisfied than before. In fact, this is the very motive behind the appropriation of land, namely the insight that land stands in a causal connection with the satisfaction of human needs, and land can be controlled. By controlling land, men actually began producing goods instead of merely using them up. Importantly, this producing of goods also involved the saving and storing of goods for later consumption. Secondly, and consequently, the higher productivity achieved through the economization of land made it possible that a larger number of people could survive on the same given quantity of land. Indeed, it has been estimated that with the appropriation of land and the corresponding change from a hunter-gatherer existence to that of agriculturalist gardeners and animal husbandry, a population size 10 to 100 times larger than before could be sustained on the same quantity of land. However, the economization of land was only part of the solution to the problem posed by an increasing population pressure. through the appropriation of land, a more effective use was made of land, allowing for a larger population size to be sustained. But the institution of land ownership in and of itself did not affect the other side of the problem, namely the continued proliferation of new and more offspring. This aspect of the problem required a solution as well. A social institution had to be found that brought this proliferation under control. And the institution designed to accomplish this task is the institution of the family. As Thomas Malthus first explained, in order to solve the problem of overpopulation, along with the institution of property, in his words, the commerce between the sexes had to undergo some fundamental change as well. Now, what was the commerce between the sexes before, and what was the institutional innovation brought about in this regard by the family? In terms of economic theory, the change can be described as one from a situation where both the benefits of creating offspring, namely by creating an additional potential producer, and especially also the costs of creating offspring, namely by creating an additional consumer or an additional eater, where both these things were socialized, that is, reaped and paid for by society at large, rather than the producers of this offspring, to a new situation where both benefits as well as costs involved in the procreation were internalized by and economically imputed back to those individuals that were causally responsible for producing them. Now, what the precise details may have been, it appears in any case that the institution of a stable, monogamous, but also a polygamous relationship between men and women that is nowadays associated with the term family is fairly recent in the history of mankind and was preceded by an institution that may be broadly defined, and I'm using those terms used by Engels, as unrestricted or unregulated sexual intercourse, or as group marriage, or also sometimes referred, especially in socialist circles, as the system of free love. The commerce between the sexes during this stage of human history did not rule out the existence of temporary pair relationships between one man and one woman. However, in principle, every woman was considered a potential sexual partner for every man, and vice versa. In the words of Friedrich Engels, and I quote, men lived in polygamy and their women simultaneously in polyamory, and their children were considered as belonging to all of them. Each woman belonged to every man, and each man to every woman. So far, Engels. Now, what Engels and many later socialists failed to notice in their glorification of the past, and in their view, supposedly again future institution of free love, however, is the fact that this institution has a direct effect on the production of offspring. As Ludwig von Mises has commented, and I quote, "It is certain that even if a socialist community may bring free love, it can in no way bring free birth." Now, what Mises implied with this remark is that free love had consequences, namely pregnancies and births, and that births involved benefits as well as costs. This did not matter as long as the benefits exceeded the costs. That is, as long as an additional member of society added more to it as a producer of goods than it took from it as a consumer. And this may well have been the case for a while. But it follows from the law of returns that this situation cannot last forever. Inevitably, the point must arrive when the cost of additional offspring will exceed its benefits. Then, any further procreation must be stopped, and moral restraint must be exercised unless one wants to experience a progressive fall in average living standards. However, if children are considered everyone's or no one's children, because everyone entertains sexual relations with everyone else, then the incentive to refrain from procreation disappears or is at least significantly diminished. Instinctively, by virtue of man's biological nature, each woman and each man is driven to spread his or her genes into the next generation of the species. The more offspring one creates, the better, because the more of one's genes will survive. No doubt, this natural human instinct could be controlled by rational deliberation, but if no or little economic sacrifice has to be made for simply following one's animal instincts, because all children were considered and were maintained by society at large, then no or little incentive existed to employ reason in sexual matters, that is, to exercise any moral restraint. From a purely economic point of view, then, the solution to the problem of overpopulation should be immediately apparent. The ownership of children, or more correctly, the trusteeship over children, had to be privatized. Rather than considering children as collectively owned by or entrusted to society, or viewing childbirth as some uncontrolled and uncontrollable natural event, and accordingly considering children as owned by or entrusted to no one, children had to be regarded as entities which were privately produced and entrusted into private care. Moreover, and finally, with the formation of monogamous or polygamous families came another decisive innovation. Early on, the members of a tribe formed a single unified household, and the intertribal division of labor was essentially an intra-household division of labor. Now, with the formation of families came the breakup of a unified tribal household into several independent households, and with that also, of course, the formation of several or private ownership of land. That is, the previously described appropriation of land was not simply a transition from a situation where something that was earlier on unowned now became owned. But more precisely, it was a transition where something previously unowned was turned into something owned by separate households, thus also allowing for the emergence of inter-household division of labor. Consequently, then, the higher social income made possible by the ownership of land was no longer distributed as was formerly the case, namely to each member of society according to his needs. Rather, each separate household's share in the total social income came to depend on the product economically imputed to this household, that is, to its labor and its property invested in production. In other words, the formerly pervasive communism might have still continued within each household, but communism vanished from the relation between the members of different households. The incomes of different households differed, depending on the quantity and quality of invested labor and property. And no one had a claim on the income produced by the members of a household other than one's own. Thus, free riding on others' efforts became largely, if not entirely, impossible. He who did not work could no longer still expect to eat. Thus, in response to mounting population pressure, a new mode of societal organization had come into existence, displacing the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had been characteristic of most of human history. Let me just end with a quote from Ludwig von Mises who nicely summarizes this. He says, "Private ownership in the means of production is a regulating principle which, within society, balances the limited means of subsistence at society's disposal with the less limited ability of consumers to increase. By making the share in the social product which falls to each member of society depend on the product economically imputed to him, that is, to his labor and his property, the elimination of surplus human beings by the struggle for existence, as it rages in the vegetable and animal kingdom, is replaced by a reduction in the birth rates as a result of social forces. Moral restraint, the limitations of offspring imposed by social position, replaces the struggle for existence. Thank you.